Hey, everybody, and welcome to Comics and Cinema. I'm your host, Alex Klein, and today we have a special surprise for you guys. We are going to be breaking down the brand new She-Hulk trailer that just premiered like an hour ago. I've only seen it one time, but I have a very special guest who I think has seen it more than me, maybe twice. Also here to help me break down Moon Knight. Please welcome frequent guest, Maya. Maya, welcome.
Hey, Alex. I
Glad to
want to
have
show
you.
off my Avengers mug.
Oh, very nice, very classy. I have a worse one upstairs that's just plain old white, but that one's definitely fire. But yeah, welcome. Excited to have you. Let's dive right in. So I only heard about this trailer like 20 minutes ago, and so I watched it on the big screen in my basement, and then I watched it a second time with the sound off on my computer. I'll say it looked a little better on the computer. My short review of this trailer is I really liked it. I'm very excited to see this show, and that CGI is not good. Those are and which I don't think means the show is going to be bad. I'm almost curious if they're going to maybe do some tweaks going forward. But those were kind of my first blush comments around it. What did you think of the trailer?
No, I totally agree about the CGI. I was kind of saying in our chat like it looked very Fiona from Shrek,
Yeah.
but but I feel like they still have time to make some corrections and stuff. So I'm hoping that it looks better. I was so curious, like especially not being a comics reader, and then like looking at some of the comic covers and like how she's portrayed in the comics, like her size and like her like what she looks like changes a lot. So it's nice to finally see what she's gonna look like. But I feel like this show is gonna be made for like young adult women. Like some of the top, I was so surprised that they're exploring like dating, they're exploring like career. So I'm really like friendships. I'm really excited to kind of just see where they take this story because I think with Hawkeye and Miss Marvel, when we got the trailers, it kind of felt Disney Channel original, but this actually felt like I don't know where wine country, because there's like one scenery that made me think of that, meets kind of just like Easy A meets another like fun film comedy type show, and a little bit of Insecure too in terms of like exploring her career and things. So I'm excited.
Yeah, that's a great little list of movies and shows there. And I think I kind of got flashes of that as well. I did catch a couple of kind of like, ooh, I feel like I've seen a comic book cover of that shot of like
Mhm.
her coming down from the sky. There was a bit where obviously her costume was great too. And like I said, I mean, the CGI is not great, but I think what they've done and what they've shown is perfect. Like that is exactly kind of how I pictured She-Hulk. And there's a really cool shot that I liked of her and Hulk jumping somewhere, and
Yeah.
like he's huge and she's a lot smaller than he is, which is exactly how it is in the comics. And so I was like, okay, that looked really cool as well. We saw a shot of Emil Blonsky being like laughing from his cell, and I think Brian pointed out that that cell is from Shang-Chi, so when he
Mhm.
gets kind of taken in. But yeah, other than that, I didn't really catch much more. I really liked the idea that she's going to be a lawyer for superheroes, or just a superhero type, superpowered lawyer before she was even Hulk, it sounds like. So that's interesting. And I like that she's obviously has some skills, and it's not because of her powers that she got the job. Like it was on her merit, which I thought is fantastic too. But I'm excited. Yeah, that whole bit at the end where she's like carrying the guy in through the thing, I thought that was great. I was like, oh wow, that's awesome. Do you
Yeah.
want to? What did you say? Like, do you want to order? Should we share a fry or something like
Order
that?
them to go.
Yeah, order them to go. Yeah, I think it'll be pretty funny. We didn't see. Is her name Jamila Jamal?
Jamila Jamil.
Jamila Jamil.
Yes.
Okay,
Well,
from
we saw a quick clip of her in it, so that was exciting.
okay. I didn't even catch that. It must have been really fast.
Yeah, Kevin put like a screenshot in our Discord, so that's how it was super quick. I feel like all the faces just went by really quick if you weren't the Hulk or She-Hulk.
Yeah.
But I was thinking they were going to show a little bit of Meg The Stallion because they announced that she's going to be like making a cameo in the show, and obviously they're
Ooh.
going to save it. But I thought there could have been a rare chance whenever the trailer came out that we would see her, which would be hilarious.
I'm glad. I honestly hope they don't, just
Yeah.
because whatever episode that is that she shows up in, and I hope it's recurring too. I hope it's not like a little cameo. I hope she's got a part, which would be just so balling for her. I'm very excited for the show. I think I'd said that this is, now that Miss Marvel is slated to come out in a month, this is my most anticipated MCU show. And I'm pumped. We've got Miss Marvel and then Thor and then She-Hulk, which is so funny because it used to be, what was it? It was like Hawkeye, Moon Knight, and Doctor Strange. So it's like we get these little pods of films and TVs, and I'm excited for this next quarter, I guess you could say, financial quarter of Marvel properties. But speaking of which, we have a pretty big Marvel property here to break down tonight. We're going to be talking about Moon Knight, every single thing about Moon Knight. So full spoilers for the show. It's been out now for a couple weeks, I think. I mean, I guess, the finale came out during Doctor Strange, so it's been out for 2 weeks. Hopefully you all have had a chance to check it out. If not, definitely do it. It's definitely one of my favorite of the MCU shows, and we'll get into that, Maya, to see if we can dare rank it amongst all of the other TV shows and properties. But we're going to talk about all of the episodes. We're going to break down the characters as well, which I really like personally. Now that especially we're part of the Nerd Life Network, I love that Earth's Mightiest Weirdos gets to break down each episode by episode each week, and then I get to talk about the entire thing after it's done. And I maintain that I love it that way because I feel like sometimes you see things in one episode and then you start jumping to a bunch of conclusions, and then none of that happens in the next episode or whatever it is. And we'll get to some pieces of that too. One of the big ones being that I think when I rewatched them all at once, the finale played way better on a rewatch because it almost felt like the last 2 episodes were just one big episode because it picks up right after it left off. I was like, wow, okay, this actually makes a lot more sense.
For sure. And I was surprised, like, I think a lot of the creators, other YouTube creators that I follow, they'll do the individual episode breakdowns, but don't like go back and do like the full like review, because my viewing experience after doing a rewatch of all the episodes was so different. So I'm excited to dive in.
Yeah. So let's start with just overall thoughts of this season, and I'll let you start, and I'll interrupt. I'll wait till you're done talking, but overall thoughts on the season as a whole. Did you have a favorite episode? Was there any favorite moments, anything like that? Like what made Moon Knight work for you as a show?
For sure. And I think what worked for me is that there's so much focus on the character versus the hero. I think I think of my favorite Iron Man or Captain America scenes. They're not necessarily focused on like Tony Stark or Steve Rogers. Like the things that get me excited is them as a hero. And for this show, like honestly, when I'm talking about the show, I rarely say Moon Knight unless I'm talking about the title of the series, like Moon Knight in his costume. Like, so I just love how we were able to dive so deep into Stephen Grant, Mark Spector, and just really feel like that personal connection to who they are, not like when they don't have the costume on. And so my favorite episode, with that said, is episode 5, because really, really emotional episode. And it kind of goes back into his both like Mark and Stephen's past, kind of how they got there. It was very, very emotional. I actually cried on my rewatch because it was just so moving. So I think just like the focus on them as people and exploring a mental health issue that I wasn't very familiar about really did it for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've been thinking about it too. It's tough for me to pick what my favorite episode was. Like I remember too, when I was first watching it, like the first episode, I thought it was really good when I first watched it, but it didn't like grab me a ton. So like after I was done, I was like, okay, we'll see next week. Like I had no plans to rewatch it. And then when the second episode came out, I was like, oh, things are heating up. Like this. I like the second episode more than the first. And then I was like, man, I like the third more than the second. And then I like and it kept being that way, even with the finale. Like I I just thought that all of them did such a good job, and I would almost say maybe like either the fourth or the fifth episode was my favorite. I too got incredibly emotional watching that fifth one, and even on the rewatch, I got emotional on some other scenes, knowing what I knew from that, and we'll get to that when we talk about it. But yeah, I loved this show. Moon Knight, he wasn't necessarily one of my favorite characters. But he's someone that I've always had an affinity for. Like I've got a painting on the wall over there that is of Moon Knight, and it was just something about like the fact that he's a lunar, hero. That I've always loved the moon. I've always loved space, and so the fact that he's got like a moon and he's got he's brutal and he has multiple like there's so many cool things about him. He reminds me a lot of Boba Fett in that sense, or at least when you're looking at him from an outside perspective, where like everybody loves Boba Fett, but no one really knew much about him. It was like, oh, he's a cool looking character, right? And so Moon Knight's the same way. When you're on the surface, he's super cool. Like he's got a cool costume, he's a badass, he's got interesting stuff. He's in Egypt, like we love that action adventure. But then when you dive into it, you're like, oh wow, he's actually a really complex character as well. And I'll be honest, I think the movie did a better job than the comics did overall, because I think one of the one of the credits to the comics is that they have the option of, okay, somebody just told this Moon Knight story. How can I build on that? How can I maybe change something, or how can I do this? Whereas now the show is like, well, we have all of this source material. What pieces of it are we going to pull in here? Like at the beginning, when Moon Knight first started, I don't think they really dove into the fact that he had a mental disorder. Like it was almost like a excitement. You see it on the front of the cover where it says when one becomes three or something like that. And it's like he's just using he's pretending to be other people to get what he wants, right? Like Jake Lockley gets him the scoops and Steve. And so it was like almost played off for fun. And then eventually the comics were like, actually, he has, multiple personalities and it's actually a serious issue. And so the fact that the show skipped over all of that stuff and kind of skipped over some of the corny pieces and really drilled down to what makes this character so interesting, I think stands the test of time comparatively to the comics. And there are some great comics out there, but this show wouldn't be what it was without those comics. But it's still really cool to see. So yeah, this is in terms of ranking it, because I think I had my number one was WandaVision, my number two was Loki. I'd almost throw it in between the two of them. There's days where I may even say I like Moon Knight better than WandaVision. So I loved the show.
Yeah, I definitely dethroned Loki because that was my favorite.
Nice.
And I'm like, everything ebbs and flows, so we'll see like in a month from now. But it really resonated what you said about like him being like a cool looking character and like just the aesthetic. For like I was Moon Knight for Halloween last year.
Yeah.
Nothing about like outside of just like the high level about his character. I knew nothing about him. I just like, oh my gosh, he's so cool. And so like actually being able to like pair this really awesome series with like someone I thought was just really cool and just very interesting is great.
Yeah. This also too, I think do the math. This marks the first live action series with a brand new character. So all of our TV shows were all of OG characters, and that's the other thing that kind of excited me too. Was it was like twofold, right? With the shows that yes, we're going to get these shows where we can dive into these characters that maybe didn't get as much in the movies, but then at the same time we can have shows where we're introducing a brand new character, and both of those are really exciting. But after having Wanda and then Loki and Hawkeye and then Falcon and Winter Soldier, it was nice to have a brand new character and get back to that conversation of like where are the rest of the Avengers, right? Like where does this stack in the MCU? Like I always love having that conversation. You didn't get to do that much with the other ones because you're like, okay, this kind of takes place a couple of months after Endgame. That makes sense. But with this one, it was like they didn't even mention the snap in this one. Now that I'm thinking about it, like we didn't hear anything about that. So do we even know? Is there anything in this that would indicate when it took place? Because if I'm remembering right, Easter egg wise, we heard Madripoor mentioned, and we also heard that, and we heard the ancestral plane mentioned by Taweret. And that's it, I think. So I don't know when this takes place. It could be right after, it could be right before. I don't know.
Yeah, it's so standalone to the point where I can't even place it. But I actually like that. Like I'm not thinking of any other property remember there was like after the first 2 episodes, there's like, oh, this is the connection, this, and this, and it was a stretch. But yeah, I'm really curious to know how this is going to connect. And I actually have a few questions for you, but we can probably get to it.
I've got some questions too. There's always going to be a couple of them coming out of these shows, but the nice thing I think with a lot of them was more of like interest, I suppose you could say, of like, ooh, I'm curious about this versus like this, this part didn't make sense, and kind of what we see with some of the other stuff, like that doesn't fly, or like we're talking about with She-Hulk, oh, the CGI didn't really add up. The only thing I would say overall was I thought the CGI was great overall. There were a couple of, I wouldn't even call them cringy moments. I know the biggest one, and the only reason I say it is because everyone in the room screamed it when I was watching the first episode. It was with my cousin and my brother, and we were all in the same room together watching it. And when he's driving around that corner and the cars are chasing with him, they were like, "Oh my God, that CGI is terrible." And I was like, "Wait, what?" But now I can't not see it, and I have to give it to them. Like, okay, if the CGI doesn't have to be perfect, but if it takes you out of the episode to make you say, "Oh, that's CGI," that means that it's a little under par, in my opinion. And so there was a couple moments like that, but overall, for the amount of stuff, for the kaiju fight at the end, for his costume changes, all of that felt seamless. Like I was never taken out of the show with that stuff, which I think is where it counts, right?
For sure. Yeah, there was one scene where I'm like, because I'm so used to seeing the CGI Moon Knight. So when I think Oscar Isaacs had his, like he didn't have like the face covering, you can see that it was actually like a physical costume. I'm like, oh, that looks kind of different. But I agree. I think
what scene is that you're talking about?
I think it was the last episode. I gotta think when he was. I think it's the scene where he's talking to Layla, and I think. And maybe because I was just going back and rewatching all of them, I'm so used to seeing the CGI costume, which is not that different. But like when we actually, maybe because we don't see enough of like the real costume, it's all CGI and made it look a little bit different. But I have to track down that scene, because that was just like a thought. But the guy jumping on the truck in that first episode, oh my God, it was so bad.
Yeah, and the reason I asked is because you made me think of one other scene, which was in the fourth episode, or it's the fourth, maybe the third, when they go to Mogart's, and he's, he just got stabbed by all that stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And Layla I think she just gets hit by the horse, and he stops everything that he's doing. His mask comes off, and he goes, "Layla!" And I was like, dude, what are you doing? And I get it. Like, oh, Mark cares about her for real. But it was such a cringy scene. But beyond that, it felt very Iron Man-y, of like the way his head was with the costume. It like kind of, you know what I'm talking about. And so that one was strange. But it's like half a second. So it doesn't last very long. And then, of course, he's in that same scene jumping off the pyramid with his giant cape, and I'm like, all is forgiven, because that part is just so sick. So yeah, it had a couple bits like that, but overall I thought the CGI was great for the budgets that they're giving these shows. And the other question I'd ask you is, what do you think about the pacing of the show as a whole, in terms of, it's only 6 episodes. That last episode is strangely short. I think it's only like, without credits, like 38 minutes, something like that. Did you feel like at any moment in the show it felt really rushed? Because obviously there's a piece of it that is by design very fast moving to make you be like, what's going on? Like that's part of the show. But I felt like there may have been towards the end a little bit of like, man, I wish we could have gotten like 1 or 2 more episodes to flesh a few things out.
For sure. I mean, at first, and honestly, I think the episode that you, Kevin, and Brian, and I think Anthony were talking about, like, I think after episode 5, is that the episode? It was one episode you're kind of predicting if, what would be the post-credit scene. And you're like, I don't think we're going to get anything about Jake. I think it's going to be in the post-credit scene. So I'm like, okay, like, in this post-credit scene, I'm good enough. Like, that's fine with me. So I do see why a lot of people are saying it's rushed, and I do agree, because the only piece that I would have wanted to see a little bit more of are the gods. And I know it's going to be a lot to show, like, all these ginormous gods fighting each other. I don't necessarily need to see it, but it would be a good understanding like what they look like. 'Cause especially going back and watching the first episode and how they tease the Lord, my pronunciation. Enid? Like whatever the nine
Oh,
god
the Ennead.
Ennead. And I'm like, oh. So I'm thinking, like in my rewatch, I'm like, oh, that would have been cool to kind of just see them live. But knowing that they may not probably come back, I'm totally okay with not seeing it. So I was fine with the only one I felt like could have been, well, okay, there's two things. The ending, the finale, where I felt like it could have been a little bit more. I also think episode 2, where it was just like, okay, Steven, come on,
Yes.
you know you're getting your
Yes.
ass kicked. Like, just give Mark the body. Like, and I get it. We got to see the cool Mr. Knight costume and kind of like the back and forth there. And his interactions with Layla I thought was really valuable, but I'm like, okay, you know, any sane person wouldn't just get their ass kicked by some of this powerful force and not try to seek any help. So that was the only other piece where I'm like, okay, they could have taken that out.
Yep.
But
I
overall, I
had
thought it
that
was
same
pretty good.
complaint with episode 2 of like,
Mhm.
dude, come on, man. And it wasn't even at that point. It was like midway through. I'm like, you have a woman who just found you through GPS telling you that she's your wife. If I was you, I'd be like, all right, we need to sit down and you need to tell me everything you know because I
Yes.
clearly don't know anything. And he just kept on being like, I don't want to talk to you. And which I get because he's a different person. But at the same time, I feel like they stretched that so thin. Like, I'm glad the way it ended by the end of that second episode because I remember saying to myself, if they keep pulling this in episode 3, I'm gonna be mad. And they
Yeah.
didn't. They didn't, right? Like it moved on, but it did wear out its welcome by the end of that
Mhm.
episode. Which is fine. I mean, that's part of the show was like the confusion behind who is Mark, who is Steven.
Mhm.
Did you notice too? I read that Jake Lockley actually makes multiple appearances in besides obviously the moments where we don't see him, right, where he's killing people, but they said that there's moments where he'll be looking in a reflection and there's a third reflection of him in there, which I did notice in a few. Again, it's not like you can't tell that it's him,
Mhm.
but they Phase Zero did an interview with one of the showrunners, and he was saying like, yeah, there's definite Easter eggs in the other episodes of Jake, and beyond the things that people have caught. So I was like, oh, that's
Mhm.
interesting. So maybe it'll make more sense, or they'll have a little bit of some revelations if we get a season 2 about like
Mhm.
how did Jake come to be, and we can talk about that right now because again we're talking about the whole season. So Jake to me was fascinating because again totally different from the comics where they purposely are holding back this third personality. And I've heard some people saying that maybe he even has more personalities inside him,
Mhm.
which is interesting to think about. But at the same time, I wonder again, how much can you stretch a mental disorder before it becomes a caricature, of like,
Mhm.
oh, this guy's got 18 personalities in his head and he can be whoever he wants to be. Like, this is a good thing. But I feel
Mhm.
like 3's enough. But I still thought it was cool that we got to see him at the end. He's a totally different person, and I just hope we get more of him, or at least get. I don't know. I feel like you could just have the whole second season be about Jake and how Mark doesn't know who he is and whatnot. Like you don't even need a villain. Though
Mhm.
it would be cool to have some B-level villain that he has to fight, but that the real turmoil is within himself.
For sure. Wow. Okay. Because I remember that was like a big question I had is like, does Jake know the others existed? And I figured they would.
Ooh, that's a good question.
But if he's watching from reflections, then
Oh
he
yeah, right. Mm-hmm.
so he knows what's going on. So it's interesting to kind of like he's probably seeing Mark and Steven interact, and he's just there quiet on the side. Like you would think, I don't know if there's any sort of brotherhood with just multiple personalities. I mean, we saw it with Steven Mark,
Yeah,
but
we're getting there.
you would think that you would, he would want to interact with them. But I mean, it also, we don't know what his relationship with Khonshu is and if it's like more extreme in terms of threats and kind of like holding his life against him. So like you said, I'm gonna be really excited to see kind of like the next phase of Jake Lockley for
Yeah.
sure.
I noticed something too, and I guess we can kick it off starting and kind of continuing talking with the first episode. When Steven's in the gift shop, he's working with a bunch of Tau Edit
What? Yes,
stuffed animals,
I
and he's
had
like
it on my notes. I did not recognize that.
never realize, and he even like talks with Donna about it, And I was like,
Yes.
what? How did I miss that or forget? And again, that's like the beauty of watching it all at once. I thought
Mhm.
that was so cool.
That was, and I'm like, wow, this first episode was so much foreshadowing.
Everything he explains with that girl saying like, you get to go down the field of reeds and all this stuff, and the one thing I was thinking, this was one of my questions for you, was, she puts trash inside the pyramid. Do you think there was any deeper meaning there, or was that just a gag for, showing that he cares? Because I was trying to think, like, is there something foreshadowy about the fact that she put something in the, I don't know, there may not be, but
What?
I was just like,
Because I
interesting.
remember the scene where um Arthur and his people were like going and like they found the tomb and it's in the middle of the pyramid. I think it was like in the middle. So I'm like, maybe like where she put whatever the trash is was that the place they went. I don't know.
Yeah, it's because
But
the gods are trash, Maya. That's probably why
maybe.
they can't keep up.
But
And it's funny, going back to what you said earlier about the gods. Um, and I love this. We're just going to talk about the show like this. I don't think we're even going to go episode by episode. We can just talk about it all.
cool.
When you said it would have been cool to see them more, and I totally agree. Like I was honestly dying to see Anubis. He's like one of my favorite Egyptian gods, and we didn't, which
Mhm.
we've still got a chance to. But I think it's funny because if the gods had showed up, say in that that third episode or whichever one it was, I feel like they would have taken down Harrow, and then that would have been the end of the episode. Because, like, yeah, I don't know. I feel like the avatars themselves, sure, but like if the actual god was there, I feel like they'd be like, he's lying, like, because they're physically present and can see it versus just seeing through someone. I don't know though. That's maybe just a guess.
For sure. And I think what didn't work in terms of the gods for me is I had to wait until y'all were discussing it after to realize the guy in the suit was Osiris. Like for like the avatars and the gods, I would have wished to know like who was who a little bit more to like them distinguish it. Um, so yeah, that was just like one thing. But yeah, there's no way that all those gods would like be in their ginormous form and then um, they won't be able to take down Arthur. So that's definitely fair. I would crap, branch just broke. I totally forgot what I was saying about Arthur. But yeah, I totally agree with that.
Nice, nice. I'm looking through here too. One of the questions I had when I was I just made a couple of notes on each of the episodes. And is Steven the main character of this show, or is it Mark that's the main character, would you say?
That is a good question.
Because the show opens, and I said, we see life through Steven's eyes, with Mark being who comes later. But at the end
Hmm.
of the day, Mark is the one that created Steven, but you get 2 full episodes of just Steven, basically. You get a little bit of Mark, but then even by the end of it, the triumph in his mental prison is Steven being like, Later's Gators, as he leaves, like it was Steven who gets to leave. But then when they wake up, both of them are there together. So I guess it could be 2 main characters that then
Hmm.
merge into one. But I just thought it was fascinating of like, if you had to pick one, who would you say who the main character is?
I would still say Mark, even though I feel like it's both of them. But for some reason, maybe after that, like episode 5, it kind of like changed my view because when I thought that Steven was going to stay dead, I'm really putting him at the center. Like, oh, Steven was a projection of his trauma, and it made me view the whole show very differently. But I still think it's Mark just because we got more of his background. It wasn't Steven's background when we're understanding how the relationship with Khonshu came to be, his relationship with Layla, and all these different things. So I feel like Mark, with all those different starting points, and kind of just being like the first step of everything, I think it's more so Mark. But it's like told through Steven. But even in the first episode, I still felt like, okay, when am I going to see Mark? Not that I didn't. I loved like Steven, like
Yeah,
favorite
I felt
character
the same way.
for sure. But it's just like I felt like, okay, this is kind of like he's confused. I'm confused. I'm waiting to get the answers with Mark.
Yeah. That's a good point. That like, okay,
Mhm.
this is fun and all, but what Mark needs to come out and explain what's going
Mhm.
on to the audience, sort of thing, which they really played coy with too, because he was like, "Do you really want to know?" And Steven's like, "Yeah, I work for Conchu," and it was like, Yeah, we know that. We can guess that part. No, we're talking about what's going on in your head, man. And I feel like like an actual psychiatrist or doctor would probably tell you that it is Mark that's the main character. Do not say that Steven's the main character because that is a created fiction in his head. Like, do
Right.
not support that. Which again is probably fair too. Yeah, and I even put in here for episode 2 of like Steven catching on so slowly. I thought was frustrating. I did want to point out though, if you did you notice that technically Layla is also in every single episode of the show?
Oh yeah. Wow.
Because I mean, in the first episode it's just by phone, but
Mhm.
technically she's a part of it. Because I was like, do you remember? I know I do. When the second episode came out, I was like, I can tell. I said I can tell I'm going to like her, but I'm not a huge fan of her in this episode. And then
Mhm.
each episode, I liked her more and more. And then when I rewatched that second episode, I was like, man, she is so good in this episode too. But it
Mhm.
was like the way that they chose to introduce her. It's very abrupt, and I almost was just like, what are you doing here? Like, I'm trying to figure out Mark. I don't need some other person in here trying to even mess with my mind even more.
Yeah, I definitely felt overwhelmed when her character was introduced because it's just like, okay, let me just try to play catch up here. But I still really, even when she was introduced, I thought it was like, I do feel like the idea that they're a husband and wife was a little understated in the series. Like you said, there could have been a conversation of them like, yeah, this is our past. And I remember she was like, you don't remember our adventures, our life together, all these things. I'm like, give us a flashback, give us something.
Right, right.
So I do felt like they could have added a little bit more to kind of show their connection as husband and wife. But yeah, that is crazy thing. She's in every episode.
Did you ever see Agents of Shield?
I watched the first 2 seasons, I believe.
Was Mockingbird in one of those?
I don't.
Adrian Pilecki.
It's been a minute, maybe not.
Okay, okay. I don't know why I always associate it of like Hawkeye, but like in the comics, Hawkeye was married to Mockingbird for a while. He dated Black Widow. He like had all these relationships with all these characters, and nothing ever went anywhere because he's the circus boy. Like he can't hold a relationship, and so I was thinking about that, and I was like, I wonder if that's why they did it the way that they did it. Is because that's kind of Mark Spector too. Like it's probably a good idea. Like if he's not telling her about his mental disorder, and we'll get to it too, but he doesn't tell her that his mom died. Like
Mhm.
he does not seem like somebody that's healthy enough to be in a relationship. And it even sounded like from the way that she told him of like, you came to find me because you were feeling guilty about my dad being killed, and that's the reason we met, and that's why, and then they got married. And so I almost wonder if that's a piece of it, is like, yes, they were married, and that's going to be something they look back on because they're probably going to be best friends, just like Hawkeye is with Mockingbird and Black Widow and all of that. But like, it's going to be one of those laughing later of like, I don't even know why we got married in the first place. Like, dude,
Mm.
you got problems. And he's like, haha, like, I know I do. Which I just thought was interesting because at first I was the same as you. I'm like, I need some flashbacks and stuff. But eventually I was like, honestly, they're not good together. Like, I wanted her to be with Steven.
Even
I
and I was
know.
to say that like that's actually a really good point because I felt like if they showed us how strong their like marriage was or their bond was, we would feel weird that Steven was kind of like flirting, with his girl basically. So I do
Right.
like the separation now that you say it like that. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Which brings me to a question, though. Another one of the questions that I had. Yeah, I believe it was a book in the second episode where he says like some quote, right, in French. And
Yes.
she's like, he says, that's my favorite book. And she's like, no, that's my favorite book. And I was wondering, the fact that this is his favorite book, but he created Steven when he was like 12. So he never knew Layla.
Mm.
So is this like something that subconsciously he was attracted to Layla somewhat? I don't know. And the way that I put it in here, I said, maybe it's because Layla is very similar to Dr. Stephen Grant from the movie.
Mm.
Like she is a Tomb Raider the same way that he is, and he just mimicked that personality, which is almost ironic, right? That the personality he faked ended up being identical to the person that he fell in love with. But I was curious if you had any thoughts on that of like why, because they made a point to call that out in the episode, so it had to meant something. At first, I thought, oh, this is like, it's his other psyche, right? This Steven is everything Layla wants him to be, whereas Mark is everything he isn't. But that doesn't make sense because he created her before Layla. Did you do any thoughts on that?
True. So I think now that I'm thinking about it, I always thought the relationship with Mark and Steven is that they had access to the same physical surrounding, but they just had relationships with their surroundings differently. So
Right.
Mark could have had like a book that he may or may not have read, but this is, him and Steven occupied the same room growing up.
Right.
So he could have probably delved deeper into it if it was just in the vicinity and get really passionate about it. And then Mark could be like, oh, no, I don't care about this. So I don't know. I feel like there's multiple ways you can view it, but I think that's how I viewed it. It's just like them developing their own interests, but also having access to the same resources.
Yeah. And in a way, it almost makes more sense too that they hit it off so well. Like, that he just naturally is the perfect person for her, that like
Mhm.
he would love that book because
Mhm.
of course that's her favorite book too, that it ends up being his favorite book.
Yeah.
And you look at it too with like all the Egyptian stuff, right? And he talked, that was another thing I missed when I was doing the rewatch. I'm like, wow, do you remember that in the first episode where there's like, it had to have been like 2 minutes of him not being able to sleep, and he's like throwing the Rubik's cube up and it has the thing playing, and it's like
Mhm.
basically you're kind of learning that he tries not to sleep, and during that time he just studies Egyptology front to back, and yet Mark knows nothing about it. So you're absolutely right. I think it is how they're interacting with their space differently, which is
Mhm.
is fascinating. It's just fascinating.
Yeah.
We get the Mr. Knight suit at the end of this second episode. Are you a fan? Well, and let's call this out. We actually get to see the Moon Knight suit too, multiple times, and it's really cool that you mentioned it the way you did. And I agree that this really felt like a Mark and Steven show more so than Moon Knight. Even though we get a ton of Moon Knight in this series, like we get costume show episode 1, unheard of. We get awesome fight scenes in episode 2, and in 3 we get cool stuff. And then obviously they take them away, but the amount of costume we saw in this show was impressive compared to the other. Like, we didn't get Cap until the very last episode, the Cap suit.
Right. Exactly. And for us to see so much of it and then the main character still be like the main focal point is just a beautiful thing, because every time Moon Knight was in the suit, we just knew that we're going to get just a beautiful visual experience. Like you mentioned, is that episode 3 or 4 when like they were in, like when he's like jumping up and like his like wings turn into like
Oh
a
yeah,
moon.
yeah.
It's just like every time I'm like, oh, here goes Moon Knight. It's about to be some really cool visuals with the moon, with the night sky.
Yes.
Okay. So it just made me really excited every time I saw it. But I loved the Mr. Knight costume. I thought that was just so cool.
Yeah, they did a great job with that. I'll stand by. I'm not a huge fan of the mask, only because of the broken thing in it. Just because in the comics it was clean, but I get why, right? He's got a broken psyche, so it totally makes sense. But I will say, I think we talked about at one point of like, I wonder what the inspiration was for the Moon Knight costume, because his typical Moon Knight costume doesn't look like that. And I loved it. I'm like, oh, we get, you get the mummy stuff, right? With the bandages. Well, guess what? We thought that it was original. It's not. That was a costume design straight from, I think this is from one of the Earth X series. I've never read it, but I did read an article that was showing this as one of the covers. And the guy who was designing the costumes was talking about it and said, yeah, we used this as our starting point. And Kevin loved it. And he was like, but he said, add more of the Moon Knight costume to it, of like the way that it looks like a Moon Knight costume, but then it's bandages. So that was all Kevin's part of it, was like, hey, you should get it put in. But how cool is that? So like they did pull it off. So I think that makes it even more interesting that if Jake also gets his own costume, is that costume going to be the OG Moon Knight costume? Which would be an interesting choice. It's like, and I might have to try to find a photo, but it's just a lot more sleek. There's some black in it as well. I mean, the original Moon Knight costume is just all white. There's
Hmm.
no bandages or anything. He just has a flat face mask over him that's white as well. But again, his costume's kind of evolved over time, and there's a slick. It's in the Warren Ellis run. So
Hmm.
yeah, I'll be excited to see if maybe they do some changes. Even the Mr. Knight one, they did a couple of changes. So I don't anticipate it being perfect, but
Yeah.
close enough is fine with me.
I remember, I think I may have seen you some pictures like around the time because when I put my Halloween costume together, I'm like, oh, most of these pictures he has like a black cape. And I'm like, oh, I was so mad when it was like no black at all in the series. I'm like, of course, it's like a very different visual, but
Yeah.
if they end up bringing that back with Jake, that would be really cool.
hmm And I cosplayed that Moon Knight costume. Oh, I did. Yeah, I was gonna make a joke on my joke. If you remember what I'm talking about,
Oh
Maya,
my gosh.
the toilet paper I wrapped around my head. I was gonna be like, I was doing, but I was actually doing it in that one too. So okay, I joked myself. So great. Yeah, you can check that out. Earth's Mightiest Weirdos. That was what episode? That was the Logan send Logan to MegaCon episode.
Yeah.
Third episode, I loved this and the fourth because I know I'm a huge fan of the Mummy movies. I'm a huge fan of. I mean, we get to the end. I'm a huge Godzilla fan too. There are just so many call outs in this to films that I loved. Indiana Jones. Trying to think, there was one other set of movies where I was like, wow, it's very reminiscent
Oh,
of that.
Pirates of the Caribbean.
Yes, Pirates of the
Mhm.
Caribbean. Yes, there was. And Lisa and I we're doing a rewatch of that. She hasn't seen the newer one, so it's been nice to go back and watch. But it is just I don't know what it is. I'm like the opposite of Anakin Skywalker. I love sand, and just when you can see that sand, there's maybe even a little bit of holes action. Maya, I saw some people digging with shovels.
Oh my
You
god.
never know.
Oh my goodness. All the movies that we love just wrapped it
Mr. Knight, Mr. Sir.
Oh my god.
I don't know. You do the math. You connect the dots. I so this scene, maybe the third episode might be. I say this for all of them, but there's a scene in here where Mark and Layla are on that boat, and it is that gorgeous magenta like coloring on it. It is a visually appetizing scene, but at the same time, did you notice in rewatch how insane that scene is? Because she says, "What's been going on with you, Mark?" or something like that, and he's inches away from saying that his mom just died because you don't notice that. But then when he says at the end, he's like, she died 2 months ago. So that's when he left Layla and disappeared. Like he absconded and then just hid inside of Steven. And so that was him having an opportunity to share it, and he chooses not to. And he just says, like, yeah, it's a lot. You don't want to hear about it. But I just thought it was so fascinating because she even said, like, we could have gotten it through together. That scene right there, to me, that's the solidification of they are not good together, the two of them, because she's over here bearing her soul, saying, hey, I want to help you. And he's like, well, I've never been really good at that, have I? And it's like, yeah, you're really stubborn. But then when Steven comes out later, it's like, there it is. Like you can just tell that there's a tension between the two of them, and the exact opposite when Steven's around. There's like this really exciting sort of tension between them where it's like they feel like they're best friends when they're just trying to solve stuff. But did you catch that in the rewatch?
Yes, and I'm like, wow, that scene really just showed how deep rooted the trauma. Like the person closest to you who knows all this Khonshu stuff, like the only other person who knows that about you,
Right.
you can't even tell him like the personal stuff that you have going on, like not knowing about his mother passing. So it just showed like, and I think that's probably what made episode 5 on the rewatch so hard to watch. It's like, okay, this is the way he is, or this is the reason why he's the way he is. And I'm just like, open up. Like you are so closed off. And I think that's why naturally the audience is so much easier to gravitate to Steven because, he's operating in a space where, he can be loving, he can be empathetic, he can be
Yeah.
open. And they know, yeah. That scene was really intense.
And I don't remember what your thoughts were on the spoilers for Doctor Strange. If you have not seen the movie, skip ahead a couple of minutes or close your eyes. The villain turn for Wanda. I know that a lot of people weren't a fan of that. Were you?
I was not. I was.
Okay, okay. Because I kind of see them similarly in the sense that by the end of WandaVision, a lot of people kind of assumed that she's good to go, right? And
Mhm.
I think that Marvel, to their absolute credit, is really diving into this idea that in the real world, one little activity like that doesn't fix you, right? Like, whatever trauma it is that you're facing, it's not just, it doesn't just get wrapped up in a bow at the end of the season. And so again, regardless of whether you agree, that she went to a villain, I really appreciated that they're like, let's keep diving into this, because it wasn't solved by the end of it. And with this too, they have a really great opportunity, and they maybe purposely did that, of like, you could see by the end of this, everything's good, right? Steven and Mark have kind of, but it's like, Mark still has to reconcile with Layla, which he has not done. She still doesn't know that his mom died. She has no idea that he got abused as a kid. And they haven't signed the divorce papers, right? So they have to, at some point, meet to talk about that stuff. There's more fuel for season 2 in terms of more character development, because that could make him spiral again. Look how hard it was for him to share it with his other personality. Like, how hard would that be to share with somebody who you've actively tried to avoid telling? I just think that that's right, especially with Jake coming in too, of like, you haven't told me about your mom, Mark, and you have a third person out. Like, there's just so much there that I feel like could crack him open even more, which is great for us viewers. I feel like it's going to just even be a deeper dive into his brain.
Right. That's actually a really powerful point. It's actually making me think about the MCU very differently, that it's always a redemption arc and they just stay good, and everything that they do after is for the greater good.
Right.
And like you said, it should ebb and flow, because, everyone doesn't process things differently. And a journey is a bunch of highs and lows. So, wow. Yeah, that definitely like resonated with me. And I think, yeah, I definitely see that with Mark's arc too. So I just can't wait. I hate that we don't know where the story's gonna go next. Is it gonna be in a movie? Is it gonna be another series? But they have a lot to explore with his character, a lot more.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you look at it that way, I'm going to jump to the very end. And I was like, I watched it again, because I was like, how does this end? Because it just ends. And I was like, is there any like, what happens? And so I wrote it down too, because I said there's no closure with Layla at all. They capture Harrow, they bring him there, they put Ammit into him, and then Khonshu frees him. And all we see from Layla is him saying, "You have a choice, Mark." And he says, "Release me." And then as he's being released, he then wakes up in his brain, like he heals his psych piece. And then he falls backwards, and then he's back in his apartment. So we never see what happens. But like, what did they do later? Was he just like, all right, I'll talk to you later, see ya? Or did she fly out of the pyramid, leave? Like, there's a lot to be answered for at the very end of that. And I think I'm hoping they did that on purpose. That obviously she has become she has a huge kind of arc in this as well. The beginnings of an arc of, she started off being, well, in a sense, she was kind of not the arm candy of Mark, but she was his protection of like, oh, I'm not going to let you become Khonshu's avatar. I'm going to be, babysitting you. And she's clearly doesn't need that. And she also clearly didn't want it anyway, right? Like, she's like, I want nothing to do with you. But now she's got a taste of it with Taweret. And it's like, oh, are you an Egyptian superhero? I am. And the way that she said it was like her realizing, maybe I can do some good with this. And so I need to see more of that. Like, I need to see in her struggle of like, wow, tough talk. Like, oh, when she gives him crap about Jake still being a part of Khonshu and whatnot, he's going to just be like, well, but you're also an avatar too. So you can't talk about that anymore. Like, there's just so many loose ends that I think wrapped up nicely for this season, but need to be answered immediately in the next season.
For sure. And like how you explain Layla, I almost felt, and let me know if this is kind of out there. It felt like when you're playing a video game and you have like that, your teammate, your like partner, and then boom, like now you're playing as your partner in a video, that partner or that character in a video game. That's how it felt between Mark and / Steven and Layla. Because at first she just felt like more of like that supporting piece. And then boom, now, she's the hero. She's now have her own path where she can kind of like forge her own future. So I really liked it. But like you said, they have a lot to wrap up or more to explore at least.
And then another piece that they absolutely need to explore is another one of my favorite scenes, which is in the 4th episode when her and Steven go to the tomb. And it's just like back and forth of adventure lore and lingo, and they're just so
Yeah.
excited to be in there. And I loved the bit when he came in and he said, he was like, and if your father could see you now standing in the proof of it, he'd be absolutely beaming. And she kind of is for a second like, you don't get to talk about my dad, but then she's like, you're right, he would. Like, I just, the
Mhm.
closure that she got from that, of hearing her husband telling her that, even though it wasn't technically her husband, but like coming from that same, like, that whole bit was just amazing, and I need more of that. Like, I want some more of them together, and they don't even have to be romantically involved. Like, I just want them to go on like another adventure together, because I just, him figuring out that it was the eye of Horus, and oh, this is the way the tomb looks, and let's go. Like, oh, it sounded like he was being afraid when he's like, we should go up that way, but it's like, that was actually the way to go. Like, he's super smart. Oh, just was so cool.
Yeah, that scene reminded me of Ant-Man when like Janet is speaking through Scott's body too. What's his name? Oh my gosh. Hank. Like
Oh
when they're just like having like this science conversation, or like how to get out of the quantum realm and stuff.
yeah,
That made me it reminded me of that.
yeah, that's that. Yeah, and there was a lot of good moments of that too. And we didn't call it out, but like, holy cow, Oscar Isaac's performance. I mean, it goes without saying, and it has gone without saying, but we're going to say it now, that it was absolutely incredible. But that bit where he's being possessed by Khonshu, and when Layla's being
Oh my
possessed by Tawedit, and like, just the performances that they put on in the show, and for her, like, this is her first role, and she's
gosh.
doing stuff like this and just being like, you know what, I'm just gonna do it. And it's like, wow, she's gonna be doing this for a while now, I think.
For sure.
Also very cool that we got to see Alexander the Great's tomb. Like, I loved the fact that he basically solved it, and yeah, he dies by the end of it, but like, he finds the Ushepti inside of his throat and all. I just, that was the ultimate mummy. That was a mix of like Mummy and National Treasure, which
Yes.
was great too. Some of my favorites as well. Everything about it, and then just from there going straight into the psych ward, just felt so like we got. I don't know. For me, I got everything that I wanted from Moon Knight, which was the mental disorder, being in Egypt, being in that the psych ward. Like, that's a big piece of his character now too from the comics, and so that,
Mhm.
just everything in there was so great. Kind of like you were saying, super emotional, but at the same time, very necessary, because again, in 10 years ago, you wouldn't have seen a story like that, of showing a mother being abusive to their kid on a Disney show,
Yeah.
especially to that level where they're psychologically abusive as much as they're physical too. Just, and then how cowardly his dad was, which was, and he had the Kramer hair. Did you see that too during the funeral, like the from Seinfeld? Like, he just had really. I have you ever seen Seinfeld?
I haven't.
Maya. Okay,
No.
that's okay. That's okay. But I loved his dad's hairstyle. But still, even all of that was so intense. And God, when that scene broke my heart, when he's like, your mother's not feeling well. It's just going to be the two of us this year. And then he blows his candle. He half-asses it and misses the one candle, and even his dad can't blow it out. And I was just like, that is so
Yeah,
depressing.
it was. They did. Yeah, I'm very surprised. Like with that dynamic, I was not ready for that the first time I watched it. So, ooh, we thought Eleanor Bishop was bad. No, no
Oh
way.
man, you're right about
That
that.
she
She's a
was-
princess.
Yeah, like she's a saint in comparison. So, yeah, that was intense.
Mhm.
Um,
The other thing, and I guess this is a question for you, is in this bit, Tawedit says, "Hey, you guys need to balance your scales,"
hmm,
but Jake is nowhere to be found. And so I'm in my mental head, I'm like, okay, well, they never took him out of the coffin. So
mhm,
maybe it's kind of like, if he had come out of the coffin, she'd be like, all right, give me your heart too. Like, it's got to be the three of you. But she probably had no idea, because again, it's more, they're analyzing the heart, not the head. And I
mhm.
bet you if it was the head, she'd be like, there's no way. There's more of you in there. You got to go back in. But I was still just like, huh. So if they didn't, that's how I did it. I didn't know if maybe you had any mental gymnastics you were doing.
Yeah, no, actually, I think that's like the best way to look at it. I wasn't thinking about it like that at first. I was just thinking that with Jake, because this is before I knew you mentioned that like Jake was in some scenes of the show. Like before I had that knowledge, I just thought that since he was completely controlled by Khonshu, like not active, not anywhere, no awareness from Steven and Mark, that it didn't. He wasn't in the balancing scales equation, but it's pretty similar. But I think how your thoughts around it, still in the coffin, makes sense to why he wasn't in that conversation.
Mm-hmm. And if that's the case, Steven should have just stayed in the coffin too, and then it could have just been Mark, and we
Right.
wouldn't have gotten a fifth episode.
Exactly.
Okay, so all I'll say on the six, because I want to get to some questions, is
Okay.
I'm obsessed with Amit. The minute that she showed up, I was like, "Oh, I'll be your avatar. Like, I'll do whatever you say." She had such a poise about her, the CGI character, and such a confidence in what she was doing. But I also just loved the crocodile smile, but she's got some bandages on her face, and obviously her hair was just absolutely on point, of going from dreads to a tail, and just the way she talked was just so like soothing and provocative at the same time. I was just like, I need to hear more of this,
Yeah,
or more of her.
they did a really good job with the God's voice, because the first time we heard Conchu, or just Conchu talking, I'm like, okay, I don't see him, but I can feel that this is a God talking to me.
Right.
And yeah, same with Ahmed. Her presence was amazing, and I remember that was like what I was most excited to see. Is like, okay, they're about to break her statue. What is she going to look like?
Right.
And I was not expecting how awesome she looked. And I mean, obviously, no one really agreed with what she was doing, but I thought it was interesting how. And there was a quote. Let me see if I can find it. Gosh, my notes are all over the place. But there was a quote that Arthur Harrow said. Oh my God, my handwriting is so bad. Oh yeah, sometimes the cure is a taste of the disease. He said that in episode 2, I think.
Right.
And I felt like that's Amit, because she mentioned having an avatar who had balanced scales, but end up putting her in stone. And now you have Arthur Harrow, who doesn't have balanced scales, and he's the one who's, the proper person to serve you. So there's so much irony in that dynamic with what she was trying to do. But I do think she's an interesting character. And the thing, and I guess this is a question for you. Outside of, I know that if you break the stone that releases them, and then they get put back in the stone. So now that Amit was in Arthur's body, does that mean that she as a god is gone?
I mean, that's the way that Khonshu kind of described it, was like, if you put it in the stone, you've got it. But if you put it in a person and you kill that person, that's killing the god too. So we'll see. I'm assuming so, but I hope not, because I want to see her again. Like, even if we can just put her in like a god zoo, I'm cool with that. Like, I'll go see her on the weekends. I'll make it work. I'll do whatever. Bash Bro Adventures in the chat. What's up, buddy? Good to see you. But yeah, so like I said, the more of her, the better. She had you're right, very ironic in the sense of like, you're trying to kill everyone whose scales aren't balanced, but the only person you trust to get the job done is someone whose scales aren't balanced. That doesn't make sense. Like, oh, I didn't like the guy who was perfect, so I got to make sure everyone else is, but me. Very, very hypocrite. Very, I was gonna say very hypocritical, but this is a crocodile, so yeah. And I did confirm that it was a crocodile and not an alligator. But that brings me to my next question. Amit is a crocodile, and it's interesting because his mother was the crocodile when he says "later's gators," and she says "in a while, crocodile." Is there a connection there? I don't know. Maybe. I mean, it would make sense of like the evil god also being an evil mother.
His mom being Amit's avatar.
Oh God, that would not be good. I mean, she'd be like, okay, I'm okay with some unbalanced scales, but yours are a mess. You're going right now. I'm taking your soul. I just thought it was interesting that there's not only that, but you have the same thing with Khonshu, right? Of when they go into the cave and he steps on the bird skull. in the grass,
Oh yeah.
which was like, so, is that just foreshadowing again, or was Khonshu present? Because he would have been, right? He existed that for thousands of years. So like, so did Amet at the same time. But when I'm thinking about it with the mom of like, okay, so is she punishing Mark for something that he has yet to do? No, she's Khonshuing him, right? She's punishing him for something that he did, quote unquote did. He didn't really do it,
Mm-hmm.
but in terms of not listening. But that it was weird too, because on the rewatch, he's like, come on, let's go to the cave. Literally thunder rolls, and then the dad's like, be careful, and the mom's like, hey, you watch your brother. And then they get there, mom said we're not supposed to do this in the rain. It's like, did you not try to stop them before leaving? Of like, hey, I just heard thunder, kids, no, stay here.
Right.
Bad parenting.
Right, for sure.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, next question. How did Mark set Steven up at the gift shop?
I'm so confused about that. I'm
I
very
mean,
confused. I figured that like whenever Steven started quote unquote taking over, he just thought he had to get a job. Like Mark was very separate from that decision.
right.
But for some reason, Steven is showing up to work every day. So I don't know if Mark is allowing him to be like, okay, this is your time. But it felt like it was kind of at random when Steven had control. So I'm very curious about that as well.
Because yeah, he would have had to whatever Moon Knight escapades he's doing, he'd have to be in bed by 10 or what, whatever time it is, so that he can get a good night's rest before Steven has to show up in London at the museum.
Hmm.
Which I guess he could do, right? I mean, we clearly see that he can fly and all that stuff, but I'm just wondering, maybe he was at the point of being Steven, that he interviewed as Steven and got the
Hmm.
job as Steven for his excessive knowledge of Egyptian mythology and all that sort of stuff. But I did just think that was interesting, because once that all started unraveling, I'm like, I would have never hired him. I would have been like,
Right.
wait. And he'd been like, no, it's not a big deal. I just have another personality. Yeah, no, you should have told us that when you started.
Right.
Okay, so timeline. Mark has been Moon Knight for 10 years. He has had Steven since he was 12, and Jake since maybe the military, because he says that he went into like a fugue state or something and they discharged him. I can only I'm curious as to when Jake showed up, but everything was going fine until 2 months ago when his mom died. I guess it's less of a question of more of being able to finally put all those pieces together of a timeline, which I guess leaves a few of what's he been doing for 10 years as Moon Knight? Why does no one know he exists? Or do they? Maybe they don't. Maybe he's only been operating in Egypt, or I don't know. But did you think about that at all?
Yeah, I always wondered, was that the first time that he came in contact with other gods and other avatars?
Right.
With Arthur, I'm like, 10 years.
Which
Um,
goes to the point too that Arthur has been Avatar. He's been Khonshu free for 10 years, which to me is pretty crazy when you talk about, again, everyone deals with their trauma differently, but he went through the ringer with Khonshu clearly, and it's affecting him 10 years later. That's pretty intense. Like, I would be curious to see what was it that broke him that badly. Like, I could see it if it was a couple years later, but 10 years, you've got some time to reflect. You've got some time to maybe get some therapy. Though, again, he doesn't seem like the kind of person doing that because he's putting glass in his shoes. But still was interesting to think about, because I didn't catch that when I was watching it. But I'm like, he's mad at Khonshu, but it's been 10 years. That's like being mad at your ex after 10 years.
right.
Like, come
Let
on
it
now.
go.
It had to have been bad.
Yeah, and especially knowing that in the like it's at least been 10 years since he hasn't been like Khonshu's avatar, that he's not even Amit's avatar and he's doing all of this. Like
What
I
a
was so
simp.
surprised. Like, no one's forcing the Amit is not talking to him like like Khonshu's talking to Mark. So he's really, yeah, like you said, something was the driver behind that we probably don't know much
It's
about.
like the Khonshu is almost like the God, I won't even risk saying it because I don't know if I'm saying it right, but basically he's doing some simp behavior now with Ahmed, of just being like, I'm gonna do whatever you want, even though I'm not your avatar. I hope I will be one day. He reminded
Right.
me of what movie was that where the guy was like that too? It might have been The Mummy, of like the person who does everything for the bad guy, but then at the end your reward is death, and it's like, dude, you wasted your life, man. See ya.
Yeah, very much giving simp energy.
Yes, yes. Okay, the only other thing I had on here, which was something I had called before it came up, but people were talking before the last episode of like, is Steven really dead? And I'd said I hope not, because I think that lessens the mental aspect of it. Of, again, going back to what we were talking about, of like, oh, all you got to do is go on the duat, and you're free of your mental disorder, right? Like, it's that easy. And it
Mhm.
was like, I don't think so, because in a way, I it's on recording, I believe, but I said it's like, in a way, that's kind of like what his superpower was, right? Was that he
Mhm.
has multiple people in his mind. And then we get that in the last episode, where one of my favorite lines of the show, which was, "You're the only superpower I ever needed," when Mark tells Steven that in the sand. And I was just like, they get me. They got it. I got something right.
Mhm. I and okay, wait. I gotta go back. Did you start that with like a question originally, or were you just
No.
okay? I totally. I okay. That scene was really, really great, and I just love like that like phrase around it being a superpower, and it makes me wonder: will we ever see Steven and Mark without Moon Knight? Though I know that's what they set up, but do you think it's enough for them to be heroes without the Moon Knight power? Like
Oh.
moving forward, I'm like,
Maybe, almost in the sense of like, being any other person could be a vigilante, right? I mean, Mark is trained, so you've
mhm.
got the whole scene where he's fighting those guys on the the guy who licks his sword and then gets immediately punched in the face. I love that scene because I hated that bit.
Yeah,
And but he's doing that whole thing without a costume, so
yeah,
he can fight and hold his own. Obviously, we want to see the costume, but yeah, I'd believe it. I mean, I think
mhm,
the biggest indication of that too is that it ends on both of them waking up in bed, where he's
mhm,
like, "Did we?" What, I don't even remember what he says, but Steven says something, and then Mark says something, and I was like, "Awesome!" So like, they're synced, they're linked. I'm curious to see how that goes over with Donna. I'm
mhm,
curious to see how, and I almost think it's going to be one of those things where it's left up in the air so much, right? That this is what this is what Mark wanted, was to no longer be Moon Knight. Well, surprise, surprise, buddy, you're still Moon Knight as Jake Lockley. And I feel like at that point in season 2 or whatever we get is going to be him being like, you know what? Fine. I'll just do it. That way no one else has to do it. And that's
mhm,
my purpose, because this whole time he's wanting to, be worthy of love and all of this stuff. And I feel like Khonshu used him in that sense, but I think he's going to get to this point of clarity where he can use Khonshu. Like, okay, fine,
mhm.
Khonshu is using me through Jake, but I'm going to get things done my way too. Of like doing, stopping crime, sort of thing, where maybe Khonshu says, "Oh, why are you fighting crime during the day? You're only supposed to be doing it at night." And he's going to be like, well, "What are you going to do? Stop me?" And I don't know. I feel like that would be interesting to see them kind of fight back like they did at the back, where he was bargaining with Khonshu, right? Where he was like, what, and he's like, "What, you're bargaining with me?" I think we're going to see more of that, of them pushing Khonshu back, which I
Okay.
think Khonshu kind of likes, in a sense, because I feel like everyone he's worked with has just been like, "I'll do whatever you say. I'm going to be the miserable simp, for you. I will do everything. Break me." And he's the first person maybe to kind of give that pushback of like, "Hey, I'm broken, but that doesn't mean that you can treat me this way."
For sure. Giving a little venom vibe
Ooh,
there.
yes.
And so I have a question for you,
Mm.
because obviously at the end of this show, we have, what is Steven and Mark gonna do? Layla, clearly they're setting her up. Khonshu, and there's just a bunch of, and like very similar to other Disney Plus series. We have like Monica Rambeau. We already know where we're going to see her next. But even Hawkeye, Kate Bishop, and Echo. Do you? It's almost to the point where it's like Marvel's building so many characters. Like, there's no way everyone can get their own movie and their own series, maybe. But how do you think like Marvel's going to manage like now all these new characters? Do you think everyone is going to be in some sort of team up? Because I think, was it Midnight Suns that you mentioned, like potentially being a team up with Blade? Like, do you think that there's going to be everyone has a dedicated group, or do you think there's some people going to be like individuals or just supporting characters in other people's movies or series.
Yeah, I think just based on what we've seen for the last 12 years or however long it's been, they're really using the comic book format as their
Mhm.
format for the films of like, okay, you've got one shot stories that's just a one and done, like the Halloween special or the
Mhm.
Guardians Christmas special. And then you have a character arc of, 6-issue series where it's the Moon Knight series and it's about Moon Knight and he's got supporting characters. But then you have the Avengers comic book, which is when they're all together. That's the Avengers movies. But then you have the Infinity Gauntlet. I think I even have it on my wall. Yeah, like the Infinity Gauntlet comic, which was an event series. That's like
Mhm.
Infinity War Endgame, the biggest of the big. And so, Moon Knight was in West Coast Avengers for a really long time in the comics,
Mm.
which was a completely separate comic from the Avengers comics, different roster. But they both had their own things. One was in California, one was in New York. So you could have all of these different groups kind of going on, 5 or 6 heroes here, 5 or 6 heroes there, because it's a lot to look at when you're watching it. But it also takes away from those end game level moments of like, well, we just saw this in the last movie sort of thing. Like we saw all these heroes together. So you could have it where you've got single characters having a show or a movie where other people maybe pop in for a little bit or not. And then you have the other shows or movies where it's a group setting, like Secret Invasion or
Mhm.
maybe this Midnight Suns thing. And then you have the event level things like a possible Secret Wars movie where everyone from all of the different stories is in it, or at least most of everybody. So that's kind of how I see it. It's almost like a couple different layers or levels.
Okay, that's interesting because we haven't really experienced that yet. I feel like even the sub characters
No.
in like the first few phases, like Rhodey's about to get Armor Wars, like Bucky and Sam getting their own series. So it's like all even Sharon is like kind of doing
Yeah.
things. So now it's like even more characters. That format that you mentioned is going to be really interesting to see.
And it honestly goes back to what He Who Remains said at the end of Loki, of when he was just like, not the see you soon, but the fact that once he got killed and the timeline just started splintering, and that's almost like what happened now, right? We had
Mhm.
movies, and now it's TV shows and other movies and
Yes.
spin-offs, and we're getting to this part where it's going to be unwieldy, right? Like, can we manage this giant timeline without missing a beat, without getting continuity messed up? And honestly, this is how you do it, right? You get 2 mentions of the MCU in the entire show, and you're still like, this feels like a Marvel show. This feels like it's part of the universe. I don't know where it's at, but I'm here for it. And so if they keep up with that, that's how they're going to succeed. And then they pick 1 or 2 movies or shows where they have a bigger event going on. Again, like Secret Invasion or whatever the next Avengers level movie is. As long as they don't do it frequently, it's going to be successful. Because honestly, that's the annoying part of the comics is like, we just had an event last month, or, oh, there's 1,700 different comics coming out at the same time. It's impossible to read them all. And so
Yeah.
them doing it where it's like one thing at a time every month or so or 2 months, and maybe it connects, maybe it doesn't, but it all teases for one thing, cool. But if they start going like, we've got 7 different Avengers movies coming,
Yeah,
that's when I think we should start getting nervous.
for sure. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Any final thoughts about Moon Knight? Any lingering questions about Moon Knight?
Um, okay, so just because we are fresh off of Multiverse of Madness, and I really, because I think I've mentioned these types of questions to you before, and I just try not to get in my head around power sets.
Yeah.
If you had to rank the most powerful, being a god, being a sorcerer, being a witch, what, like, in terms of 1 being the most powerful, 3 being the like least powerful, how would, like, after this series, what would you rank?
I would say that it depends, 1, 2, but it also depends on who's writing the show or the movie for whatever it is that they want it to be.
Yeah.
Because really, I think at the end of the day, it doesn't matter in the sense of like a god, right? Is this the god that can destroy everybody? Is this a Thor type god where these Egyptian gods just live on a different plane, but they're about as powerful as Doctor Strange? Maybe that's what it is. If
Mhm.
you put a gun to my head though and asked me, I would say based on all of this, Scarlet Witch, and then God, and then Doctor Strange in
Okay.
terms of sorcerers. Because I feel like if you put Doctor Strange up against Khonshu, it would be a really interesting fight
Yeah.
because now we know Khonshu can get huge. how is he going to fight that? He can disappear. He can turn back the night. Like, he can do some forms of magic. And same thing with Amit, right? I mean, Amit could easily just judge Doctor Strange, and if his scales don't balance, he's gone. But maybe he's got a spell that he can cast that would protect him. So it's like, to me, that is when you're getting into anime territory of like, you have all these really powerful characters, and at that point, and this is what I hope Marvel does too, because everyone's question is always who's the most powerful. And yes, that's important. But when you get to that level, it's all about the fights. And it's about Doctor Strange gets the upper hand in a badass scene, and then Khonshu gets the upper hand and knocks him down. And now you're rooting for, but then Doctor Strange does something even crazier. And you're like, wait. And then he goes, I saved this ace up my sleeve. I'm using it right now. And then it's like he takes out Khonshu, but then Amit shows up. And then she kills Doctor Strange. And then Scarlet Witch, like, you got to get the one-upping over and over until you get to the finale of it, which again is why anime is so great, because the fights are so long in that regard. But if you do just go to like, oh, we're gonna have one fight and it's winner take all, it would be interesting to see. I wouldn't know. I don't know, but yeah, that's my guess. Long-winded guess.
Ooh. I'm like, I always get confused with all the power sets, and I'm always trying to, especially seeing all those Infinity Stones in the drawer at TVA. I'm like, okay, nothing that I know makes sense anymore. So like you said, it all just depends on whoever they want to fight each other at that moment. So that's a good one.
And I think they kind of explained it in whatever it is too, right? Like in Doctor Strange, the Scarlet Witch is the most powerful character. Like, okay, so you've now established that she's the most powerful. Same thing with the stones, right? You've established they mean nothing in the TVA. So they will always explain to you in whatever content it is who is the most powerful. You just kind of got to listen for it, or at least assume like, okay, we get where this is going.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
But in terms of overall thoughts, like I said, it's my number one Disney Plus series.
Nice.
I love it. It's to the point where, kind of like how it is with Lovecraft, some episodes where I absolutely adore the show, but some episodes are really tough because they just evoke so much emotion.
Yes.
Like the same way with this series. And I mean, it's cool. Like I wasn't really into like ancient Egyptian type of lore, but after this, I absolutely am.
Nice, good.
Awesome. There's a lot of jumping points, like things that you can look into. Like I'm about to do a rewatch of Indiana Jones. It really just sparked a lot of great things for me.
Yeah.
I love this series, and I can't wait to like just see where it comes up next.
Yeah. This might be. I feel like maybe I thought that after WandaVision 2 of like, I can't wait to see what the Scarlet Witch is in next. And so, I guess same thing with Cap of like, I can't wait to see Cap next. Cause with like Loki, it was more, I can't wait to see how the threads of the show, weave into what's coming next. I didn't care so much about Loki, but for like Moon Knight, I just want to see Moon Knight again. Like whether that's in a season 2, which I really hope they do, but if not, in a movie or in someone else, like I just need, he's such a good character. And so, yeah, I think I would definitely put it in my top shows, and it's probably going to stay there for a really long time. But who knows? Our opinions always change as they go on. And that's why it's a great thing being human. If only though that we could be an avatar for a god, Maya, that would be so awesome. Man, we didn't even talk about the bit where Khonshu lifts him up and throws him towards the pyramid, and he just shoots off flying like, so cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I'm really glad that we got to get all of these thoughts out here about Moon Knight, a show it sounds like we both adored.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely. Great. Well, hey, that's going to do it here for us at Comics and Cinema. Thank you guys so much for listening. Next week, we are going to take the week off. So we'll have no episode next week, but we'll be tuning in the following week, which is right after Memorial Day. I will be joined, if everything works out, by the man himself, Brian, to talk about Top Gun. And I'm excited because I'm not a big Top Gun guy, and the movie looks a little cringy, but it also looks like it may actually be awesome in terms of like cool plane fights, which I love those too. So we'll see. But that is when we'll come back for Comics and Cinema. I'm your host, Alex Klein. Thanks so much for listening, and we will see you at the movies.